Forget strategy. This battle wasn't about gaining ground. It was about bleeding the enemy dry and proving a point. This is the story of Verdun, a dumb, pointless meat grinder that cost over 700,000 lives and became the ultimate symbol of World War I horror. And before we dive into it, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historians so you never miss another tale of human stupidity dressed up as military genius. The Battle of Verdun began in February 1916, and from the very first day, it showed how a single idea in the mind of one commander could trap two nations in a cycle of destruction with no clear objective and no logical end. Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff, shaped the entire event around a belief he held with total certainty. He thought he could break France, not by capturing territory, but by forcing the French army to bleed faster than Germany could. He believed that if he selected a target so deeply important to French pride that they had no choice but to defend it at any cost, he could draw them into a trap and grind them down until the nation cracked. Verdun became that target. To understand why this idea took hold, picture the Western Front in 1916. The lines barely moved. The generals clung to their old doctrines, and the soldiers lived inside trenches that offered little protection from modern weapons. Falkenhayn looked at the deadlock and decided that the way forward was not through movement, but through pressure. He wanted to force France to pour its men into a furnace that Germany controlled. He believed that he could set the terms of the battle and that France would respond exactly the way he predicted. The plan rested on that single assumption. Verdun sat on the Meuse River and held a symbolic place in French history. It contained a ring of old forts, though many of them had been stripped of their heavy guns and had fallen into disrepair. In peacetime, the French High Command believed that these forts belonged to an older era. In wartime, they became points of pride that neither side wanted to lose. Falkenhayn understood this psychology. He thought the French generals could not tolerate the idea of losing Verdun. He wanted to strike at a place that would trigger a national reaction. When the German assault began, it opened with a bombardment so intense that some soldiers said they felt the ground expand beneath them. Shells fell in waves, tearing the forest apart and covering everything in splintered wood, smashed earth, and smoke. The French frontline positions took the full force. Most trenches disappeared under the blast. Units that survived crawled out of the wreckage and could barely understand the scale of destruction. These early hours set the tone for the entire year. Verdun would not be a normal battle. It would be a contest of endurance, where each side tried to hold on while the other threw everything it had into the fire. The Germans advanced behind the bombardment and took several key positions. The French army, shocked by the speed and weight of the attack, rushed reinforcements toward the sector. General Philippe Pétain took command of the defense and tried to create a steady system of supply and rotation. He knew that the French line could hold only if fresh troops arrived in time. The road to Verdun, later called the Sacred Way, became the only lifeline. Thousands of trucks moved along it day and night to bring men, ammunition, and supplies to the front. The entire French effort depended on that one route. Falkenhayn believed the French would commit division after division to defend Verdun. What he did not grasp was that Germany would also become trapped in the same cycle. The German infantry had to cross ground that the bombardment had shredded into mud and broken trees. Their progress slowed. They met French resistance in pockets that refused to fall. The French brought more artillery into the region. Soon the Germans faced the same conditions they had created. Verdun became a battlefield where both sides suffered in equal measure. One of the most striking features of Verdun was how little strategic purpose it served. There was no clear path to victory. There was no breakthrough point. There was no large-scale maneuver that could turn the battle into a decisive win. Falkenhayn did not intend to achieve such an outcome. His only goal was to drain French manpower. This mindset created a battle that looked like a contest between two exhausted boxers locked in a clinch, throwing punches that hurt them as much as their opponent. As the months passed, the positions around Verdun turned into a landscape of craters, wrecked forts, and shattered woods. Fort Douaumont, one of the strongest points in the region, fell early in the fighting when a small German raiding group slipped inside through a ventilation shaft and captured it without a major struggle. This event shocked the French High Command. It showed how unprepared the defenses were and pushed France to commit even more troops to retake it. The fort became a symbol. Thousands died around it as each side tried to control a single structure made of cracked stone and steel. Every soldier who fought at Verdun learned what it meant to survive inside a battlefield designed for destruction. Men slept inside cellars filled with dust from constant shelling. They drank water from shell craters. They carried ammunition up slopes covered in bodies. They knew that neither side had a clear plan beyond holding or capturing a few hundred yards of ruined earth. They moved through thick smoke that blocked the sun. They climbed over wrecked guns. They listened to the constant thunder of artillery and waited for the next wave of fire. The psychological pressure on the French army grew with each month. Verdun became a national test. Newspapers across the country framed it as a fight for the survival of France. Civilians imagined the battlefield as a sacred shield that protected the rest of the nation. This belief drove the French government to demand that Verdun hold at all costs. Pétain, and later other commanders, kept the defense alive through a system of constant troop rotation. Nearly every French division served at Verdun at some point. The army spread the burden across the whole force so that no single unit collapsed under the weight of the battle. The German army faced its own strain. The initial advantage faded as the French hardened their positions. Supply lines grew slower. The terrain turned into a swamp of shattered ground that trapped men and equipment. Falkenhayn kept pushing the assault because he believed that pressure would eventually break France. But each new push produced less gain and higher losses. The German infantry felt the same exhaustion, fear, and despair as the French. They fought for positions that held no real strategic value. They watched shells fall into the same places every day. They climbed out of trenches to attack targets that shifted by only a few meters each time. The landscape around Verdun turned into something close to a moonscape. Trees lost their branches and then their trunks. Villages disappeared under layers of mud and debris. Entire units vanished in bombardments that lasted hours or days. The battlefield became so torn up that even high command struggled to recognize it on maps. Soldiers described it as a world with no life, no shape, and no hope. By the middle of the year, the battle consumed both armies. Each side believed it had no choice but to continue. Each side had poured too much blood into the ground to pull back without a political cost. Each side believed the other might collapse first. This belief kept the meat grinder turning. Verdun showed the logic of the First World War at its purest and most senseless. It revealed what happened when generals clung to pride, doctrine, and the need to prove strength. It became a contest that burned thousands of lives each week without producing any clear outcome. The French held, the Germans held their lines. The front barely moved. Yet the fighting continued because no one wanted to admit that the entire plan had been a mistake. The first thing to understand about Verdun is that the moment the artillery opened up, the battle turned into something beyond human scale. Soldiers who had fought in earlier battles thought they knew what a bombardment felt like. They were wrong. Verdun took that idea and destroyed it. At dawn on February 21, 1916, the German guns opened fire and everything changed. When people say over 2 million shells fell in the first 9 hours, it is easy to hear that as a statistic, instead of imagining what it meant for the men inside that storm. Imagine standing in a trench that shakes so hard you can feel the earth bending. The air turns white with dust. You hear the shells incoming, but by the time you hear them, they have already hit. You feel each blast in your chest. You breathe grit instead of oxygen. You try to shout to someone next to you, but the sound is swallowed by the thunder of the guns. The noise is so constant that the brain stops knowing where one explosion ends and the next begins. Everything becomes one long, rolling blast. Soldiers wrote that the ground seemed alive, as if it were breathing. They said it felt like the world was ending. The German plan was simple: crush the French defenses through sheer firepower before the infantry even moved. That meant every fold of earth, every tree, every bunker, every trench became a target. The artillery didn't just hit the front lines, it hit everything behind them too. Villages, supply points, communication trenches, command posts, nothing was off limits. As shells rained down, the landscape broke apart. Forests turned into shredded matchsticks. Hills lost their shape. Trenches collapsed. Entire units vanished without ever seeing an enemy soldier. Some men died instantly, Others were buried alive by tons of earth, clawing at the dirt until they suffocated. The ground became a graveyard before the infantry even arrived. One French soldier described holding his rifle like a lifeline while the trench caved in around him. He said he could not see more than a few feet because the smoke and dust were so thick. He kept imagining a shell hitting directly where he stood, and he waited, tense, for the final flash. Another soldier said he saw a friend simply disappear. One moment he was crouched beside him, and the next, a shell landed with a blow so violent that it erased the man from existence. There was no body, no blood, nothing, just an empty space. At Verdun, the bombardment was so intense that men sometimes died without leaving anything behind to bury. The psychological effect of this constant fire turned the battle into a test of endurance no army had prepared for. Even hardened veterans started shaking uncontrollably. Men covered their ears with their hands, pressed their faces into the mud, or curled into tight balls as if trying to shrink away from the noise. Some screamed without realizing it. Others went silent and stared at nothing. Shell shock was not a theory here. It was an everyday reality. If you were lucky, you might find a moment where the bombardment eased for a few breaths. You might hear a command shouted above the chaos. But even in those rare moments, you knew the next wave was already on the way. The bombardment also destroyed any semblance of normal military order. Trenches that once mapped clean lines across the battlefield turned into craters and twisted dirt piles. Runners could not carry messages. Officers could not locate their men. Units became cut off and isolated. Soldiers had no idea where the front actually was, because everything looked the same. A field might have been a road 5 hours earlier. A crater might have been a trench the week before. Landmarks vanished. The map no longer matched the world. And beneath all this destruction, the mud grew thick and deadly. Shells churned the soil into a soup filled with shattered wood, wire, stone, and human remains. If a soldier tried to move, he could sink to his knees or waist. Some men slipped into shell holes filled with water and could not climb back out. Others stepped onto what they thought was solid ground, only to fall into a hidden crater. Rescue was almost impossible because anyone who tried to help faced the same danger. In many cases, men drowned in mud, crying out while their comrades watched helplessly. The bombardment did not just kill with explosions, it killed with the environment it created. Inside this hell, communication fell apart. French troops waiting for reinforcements often had no idea whether anyone outside their trench was still alive. They did not know if the Germans were advancing or if the lines behind them had collapsed. Sometimes they fought for hours thinking they were the last soldiers left in the sector. The sense of isolation cut into morale more sharply than any shell fragment. Verdun became a place where time lost meaning. Days blurred together. Men described feeling trapped in one long, unending moment of terror. And for those who survived the bombardment long enough to face the German infantry, the experience was no less horrifying. The artillery had been designed to destroy everything, but it also carved the ground into a maze. Soldiers had to navigate through broken terrain while the shelling continued around them. In many places, the only safe cover was inside the wreckage of collapsed trenches or behind mounds of torn earth. Even then, safety was relative. You might hide behind a chunk of concrete that protected you from small arms, only to have a shell hit the same spot minutes later. The worst part was that the bombardment never truly ended. Even during lulls, sporadic fire kept the pressure constant. A soldier could not assume silence meant safety. Silence meant the next barrage was loading. The Germans intended to keep the French pinned and shaken, so that when the infantry attack came, resistance would be weak. Yet the French held on. They held on even when the shelling destroyed their guns, broke their trenches, and shattered their units. They held because Verdun, for them, had become more than a battlefield. It was a symbol. Losing it meant losing a piece of France itself. Some French soldiers wrote about sitting inside ruined forts while the walls vibrated with each blast. Dust rained from the ceilings, stones shifted underfoot. Each explosion felt like it would collapse the whole structure, but the forts stood and the men inside stayed with them. There were stories of soldiers who could not hear for days because the shelling damaged their ears. Others said they felt the ringing long after the battle ended. The artillery did not just destroy bodies, it rewired minds. By the end of those first days, The landscape at Verdun had become something unnatural. The trees were gone, the villages were gone, the hills were flattened or torn open. Everything was covered in a mix of mud, smoke, ash, and debris. The smell of explosives mixed with the smell of death until it became one scent that soldiers carried for the rest of their lives. Verdun was no longer a place. It was a wound carved into the earth, and through it all, the artillery kept firing because the German strategy relied on it. Falkenhayn believed the French would break if they endured enough punishment. Instead, the French refused to collapse, and the result was a brutal stalemate held together by sheer will and endless shells. Verdun became the perfect example of how World War I turned technology against the men who used it. The artillery was supposed to make war faster and more decisive. Instead, it created a battlefield where death was constant. Progress was slow, and the human spirit was pushed beyond its limit. The strange truth about Verdun is that it never delivered the result either side wanted. Falkenhayn believed he had designed the perfect plan. He pictured a battle where the French would bleed out until they had no choice but to beg for peace. He imagined a clean calculation where German artillery and German discipline would grind the French army into dust. But Verdun refused to follow any logic, and the moment the fighting dragged on, the plan collapsed. What was supposed to be a short, controlled operation turned into a marathon of pain that neither army could escape. The French held the line with a stubbornness no military theory had predicted. "They shall not pass" was not meant to become a legendary phrase. It began as a simple message shouted by troops who refused to break. It spread because it captured the entire mood of the French army. These men were surrounded by destruction, covered in mud, choking on fumes, and constantly watching shells fall around them. But they kept shouting the same promise. They were not going to move back. They were not going to surrender the forts. They were not going to let Germany claim a victory that would crush their country's pride. That determination threw Falkenhayn's plan off balance from the start. On the German side, commanders watched the battle stretch on far longer than expected. The initial shock had worn off, and the French had dug in with renewed force. The Germans realized they had created a monster. Instead of bleeding France dry, they had built a machine that fed on both armies without pause. Every day required more shells, more men, more supplies, more reinforcements, and more stamina than any previous battle. The German infantry found themselves trapped in the same misery they hoped to impose on the French. They marched through shattered woods that offered no cover. They climbed over bodies just to reach the next crater. They pushed forward a few yards, only to lose them again the next day. The fight became a slow grind, where each gain cost dozens, sometimes hundreds, of lives. The French army suffered just as terribly, even though they managed to hold the line. The price of defending Verdun was enormous. Units rotated through what soldiers called the grinder, and each rotation left them smaller and weaker. Fresh battalions marched toward Verdun with full numbers, and they returned with half their men missing. Mentally, the strain was worse. Some soldiers wrote that walking toward Verdun felt like walking toward a mouth that swallowed entire armies. They knew the odds. They knew many of them would not return, but they marched anyway because Verdun had become a symbol of national survival. The scale of casualties turned the entire region into a wound that could not heal. Every hill, every trench, every patch of dirt cost lives. A position might be taken in the morning and lost by the afternoon. A fort might hold out for weeks, only to fall during a surprise attack. Then it might be retaken again at the cost of hundreds more lives. Nothing stayed secure. Nothing stayed quiet. Every victory felt temporary, and every loss felt permanent. At the end of the battle, the casualty list would show over 700,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. That number does not show the full picture. Each one of those men had a family, a story, and a life that was either ended or changed forever. The battle reached into every home in France and Germany. It spread grief across towns and villages on both sides of the border. The destruction also weakened both armies in ways that became clear later in the war. France lost units that had been among its best trained and most experienced. These were men who had already survived earlier battles and knew how to fight in the trenches. Verdun drained them until the French army had to mix new recruits with surviving veterans just to keep its numbers up. This created a serious problem when France entered 1917, a year already full of tension and unrest. Many of the mutinies that later shook the French army came from the exhaustion and hopelessness bred at Verdun. Germany faced a similar crisis. Falkenhayn had hoped for a clean attrition battle where Germany could afford the losses. Instead, German divisions were shattered at the same rate as the French. Their supply lines stretched thin. Their morale dipped from constant failure. They discovered that slaughtering the enemy did not mean victory if you were losing your own men at the same pace. German soldiers wrote home about the same things the French wrote: the endless artillery, the ruined ground, the impossibility of making progress. Some asked why they were still fighting. Others wondered why the plan kept going when it was clearly failing. Over time, even German officers admitted privately that Verdun made no strategic sense. The deeper problem for both sides was that Verdun locked them into a fight they could not abandon. France could not retreat without losing national pride. Germany could not stop without admitting the plan had failed. So both armies trapped themselves in a loop where the only option was to keep feeding men into the fire. Generals on both sides convinced themselves that one more push, one more rotation, one more week of shelling might change the outcome. But the outcome never changed. The lines barely moved. Even when forts changed hands, the overall situation remained the same. Verdun refused to end. The landscape itself made things worse. By mid-year, the ground had become a maze of debris that prevented large advances. Artillery destroyed every chance for maneuver. Infantry attacks turned into slow crawls through mud and rubble. The environment punished both attacker and defender equally. A hill that looked safe could collapse under shell fire. A trench that offered protection one day might become a death trap the next. Men discovered that nature itself had turned against them. This created a strange form of equality. Both sides suffered because the battlefield refused to cooperate with either army. On the strategic map, Verdun did almost nothing to improve either side's position. Germany did not break France. France did not push back into Germany. The front lines in the region looked almost the same in December as they had in February. When commanders reviewed the battle afterward, they could not find a clear gain that justified the cost. Falkenhayn lost his job partly because of Verdun. French commanders, even those declared heroes later, admitted that they had barely managed to keep the army functioning. Both nations emerged weaker than before. The true impact of Verdun was hidden under statistics and official reports. It lived in the eyes of soldiers who returned home shaken, thin, and silent. It lived in the nightmares of men who heard artillery for the rest of their lives, even when the war was long over. It lived in the empty seats at dinner tables, in the broken families, and in the towns where entire generations of young men were missing. Verdun left a shadow over both countries that lasted decades. It taught a harsh lesson about what happens when leaders chase ideas instead of victories. It proved that a battle can be fought with everything an army has and still achieve nothing. The Sacred Way was not just a road, it was the lifeline of the French defense. Without it, Verdun would have fallen in a matter of weeks. Trucks, and more trucks rolled day and night along this narrow path. Drivers endured constant artillery fire, shell craters, and the fear of being spotted by German reconnaissance. Yet, despite the danger, the flow never stopped. Ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, and reinforcements streamed into the city with astonishing regularity. Soldiers arriving at Verdun could scarcely believe the efficiency of the operation. Each convoy was a small miracle, a defiance against the German plan to grind France into submission. The Germans, for their part, never realized just how vulnerable this line was. Falkenhayn assumed that, with Verdun, under constant shelling and surrounded by mountains of destruction, the city would eventually collapse on its own. He underestimated the ingenuity and determination of the French supply system. Artillery observers occasionally spotted the Sacred Way, and attempts were made to target it. But the French engineers quickly repaired bombed-out sections and rerouted trucks around shell holes. In many cases, trucks literally drove through mud and water-filled craters, keeping the lifeline intact. The French logistics officers organized a system of staggering departures and arrivals so that congestion never slowed the delivery of essential supplies. Every hour mattered, and every truck mattered, because a single delay could result in soldiers starving, freezing, or running out of ammunition during a critical defense. The efficiency of the Sacred Way also had psychological effects. Soldiers defending Verdun knew that help was always coming. They saw truck after truck arrive, bringing reinforcements and provisions. This steady rhythm reassured them that they were not abandoned, even as the German shells exploded around them. It created a mental buffer, a small but crucial layer of hope that allowed men to endure conditions that would have broken others. The road became symbolic of the city's survival. Without it, morale would have collapsed long before physical defenses failed. The Sacred Way proved that, in war, logistics could be as powerful as guns or fortifications. The French were not just fighting with rifles. They were fighting with an army of drivers, mechanics, and planners who kept the supply lines flowing against impossible odds. The continuous flow of men and material meant that fresh troops could rotate in before exhaustion or casualties destroyed the units defending Verdun. Rotations were meticulously timed so that every frontline soldier knew they would eventually be relieved, preventing total mental and physical collapse. Medics and stretcher bearers were part of this logistical miracle as well, evacuating wounded soldiers along the same routes that brought supplies in. Every aspect of survival at Verdun, from food to ammunition to medical care, relied on this single artery of supply. Without it, the Battle of Verdun would have become another story of rapid defeat rather than a symbol of stubborn endurance. The Sacred Way also highlighted the French army's discipline and organization, something the Germans often underestimated. Germany assumed that the chaos of constant bombardment and the scale of Verdun's defenses would paralyze French logistics. They were wrong. French soldiers and officers adapted constantly, repairing damage, clearing obstacles, and maintaining traffic under extreme pressure. Engineers created temporary bridges and bypasses, drivers coordinated carefully to avoid traffic jams, and officers scheduled movements so that no part of the supply chain faltered. This was not luck, it was a demonstration of military efficiency and ingenuity under fire. Each successful delivery reinforced the city's ability to resist and further frustrated German attempts to predict or disrupt French operations. The Sacred Way also became a target for German tactical errors. The Germans devoted resources to trying to interdict it, launching artillery bombardments aimed at severing the lifeline. Yet these attacks never caused a decisive collapse. The French responded with counter-battery fire, repair parties, and rerouting strategies that often allowed supplies to reach Verdun faster than before the attack. In this way, every German effort to disrupt the road inadvertently highlighted the resilience and ingenuity of the French defenders. The Germans were locked into a strategy of attrition, attempting to starve the city and wear down its defenders. But their efforts were continually nullified by the Sacred Way. Falkenhayn had underestimated one of the most important variables in warfare: the ability of the enemy to adapt under extreme pressure. Moreover, the Sacred Way had an indirect effect on the broader battle strategy. Because the French could reinforce Verdun reliably, the Germans could not simply focus on capturing key positions and forcing surrender through encirclement. Each fort that fell was soon counterbalanced by fresh troops, making territorial gains temporary at best. The Germans were drawn into endless cycles of attack and counterattack, each costing thousands of lives and yielding almost no strategic advantage. The efficiency of the Sacred Way turned what Falkenhayn envisioned as a short, decisive campaign into a prolonged bloodbath. The French effectively weaponized logistics, showing that supply lines could shape the entire course of a battle. This relentless organized movement also created an incredible sense of continuity in the city. Soldiers, medics, and commanders could anticipate what would arrive and when, allowing planning and coordination under fire. Knowing that reinforcements and supplies were coming allowed French officers to plan counterattacks, rotate exhausted units, and even conduct small-scale offensives within the defensive perimeter. The Sacred Way became a backbone for operational flexibility. While Verdun's terrain and fortifications were static, the flow of resources made the defense dynamic. French commanders could make decisions in real time, confident that their troops and equipment would arrive when needed. This flexibility proved decisive in holding the line against a numerically superior enemy. The psychological impact on German soldiers was equally significant. They watched the French rebuild and resupply under conditions they believed should have been catastrophic. German artillery crews fired shells at positions they thought would be empty, only to find fresh troops and new supplies waiting. Infantry units advancing into what they assumed were weakened defenses encountered fully manned and well-equipped positions. This constant surprise wore down morale. German soldiers realized that their calculation of attrition was failing. Each day of battle became more confusing and demoralizing because the French defenders were not only surviving but adapting faster than Germany could destroy them. Even civilians indirectly contributed to this logistical lifeline. Local laborers, workers, and drivers supported the maintenance of roads, vehicle repair, and the transportation of food and water. Verdun's survival was not just a military feat. It was a communal effort where every successful delivery reinforced the defenders' ability to resist. The battle became a citywide operation, where logistics was as critical as fortifications or artillery. The Sacred Way illustrated that wars are not won solely by soldiers on the front line, but by those who sustain them behind the scenes under extraordinary conditions. Ultimately, the Sacred Way proved that clever, disciplined logistics could counterbalance even the deadliest enemy strategies. While Verdun was a tragedy in terms of human cost, the continuous operation of this supply route ensured that France retained control of the region. Without the Sacred Way, Verdun would likely have fallen, changing the trajectory of the Western Front. What started as a narrow road for supplies became a symbol of endurance, organization, and the hidden power of logistics in warfare. It was an artery of life in a battlefield designed to kill. A moving shield that protected thousands and kept the French army fighting despite impossible odds. By the time December 1916 arrived, Verdun had become the ultimate meat grinder, a grinding testament to the brutality of industrialized warfare. The battlefield had shifted little from where it started, yet hundreds of thousands of men had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. Entire divisions had been shredded to maintain a line that, strategically, did not move. The French forts, the German artillery, the trenches, the sacred whale of it, had consumed human lives at a staggering, almost unfathomable rate. Falkenhayn's plan to bleed France white had not only failed in its intended purpose, but also demonstrated the mindless logic of attrition warfare. If you throw enough men at a fortified position, eventually someone dies, but the line itself barely budges. Verdun had become a symbol of stubbornness over strategy, ego over reason, and human life as a disposable resource in the pursuit of a national point. The sheer scale of Verdun highlighted the absurdity of industrialized, ego-driven military thinking. Generals on both sides believed that relentless pressure could achieve victory, but what it achieved instead was a cycle of endless suffering. Trenches crisscrossed the landscape like scars across the earth, each cratered shell hole filled with water, mud, and the remnants of soldiers who would never leave. Corpses often lay exposed for days, sometimes weeks, and the smell of decay mixed with gunpowder and smoke was a constant reminder that the human cost was literal and visceral. Medical units struggled to cope with the sheer volume of casualties, often improvising with makeshift hospitals in barns, basements, and even caves carved into hillsides. Each new casualty reinforced the grinding, mechanical nature of Verdun. Death was not a side effect. It was the metric by which the generals judged success. Falkenhayn's ego was the invisible hand guiding this destruction. He believed that the French army could be worn down, morale broken, and political capitulation forced. He misjudged the French will to resist and underestimated the effectiveness of French logistics, including the Sacred Way. German forces threw millions of shells, marched tens of thousands of men, and burned villages. But the French defenses simply adapted. Each German offensive was met with fierce resistance, and every territorial gain was temporary. For all the effort and death expended, Verdun remained essentially a stalemate, symbolizing the futility of strategy dictated by personal ambition rather than practical objectives. The human experience of Verdun further emphasizes its role as a symbol of pointless attrition. Soldiers endured unrelenting artillery, freezing winters, and mud that could swallow men whole. Infantry attacks were staggered, often poorly coordinated, and resulted in horrific casualties for the minimal territorial gains achieved. Machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire ensured that any advance was paid for in blood. For the ordinary soldier, the battle was a nightmare, measured not in kilometers, but in hours of terror, minutes of helpless exposure, and the constant threat of sudden violent death. Letters home described hellish landscapes, mangled comrades, and the ever-present smell of death. Commanders measured progress in meters, while thousands died trying to move the line by a handful of yards. In this way, Verdun's static battlefield reflected the inefficiency and tragedy of a strategy focused on attrition. When ego and ideology trump human life, the cost becomes unimaginable. Another layer of absurdity was the way both sides glorified their endurance while ignoring the pointless nature of the struggle. French propaganda celebrated heroism and resistance, turning Verdun into a symbol of national pride. "They shall not pass" became a rallying cry, highlighting courage under fire. Yet this bravery was demanded by circumstance rather than strategic necessity. The Germans also promoted narratives of sacrifice and valor, though their leaders knew the battle was not advancing national objectives. Verdun's reputation grew not because it was tactically significant, but because it demonstrated the extremes of human suffering and endurance. In effect, the battlefield became a theater in which generals displayed their stubbornness, pride, and personal ambition at the expense of life itself. The attritional logic also had political consequences. Both the French and German high commands saw the battle as necessary to maintain morale and credibility at home. Governments insisted on continued attacks and defenses, fearing that any withdrawal would be perceived as weakness. In practice, this meant that men continued to die for little to no strategic gain. Front lines shifted imperceptibly, artillery fired endlessly, and reserves were sent forward to replace losses. Political considerations and ego-driven decisions ensured that the battle dragged on for 10 months, consuming resources that might have been more effectively deployed elsewhere. Verdun became a textbook case of how political and personal pride can prolong conflict unnecessarily, resulting in human carnage on an industrial scale. The logistical miracles of the French side, particularly the Sacred Way, highlighted the resilience and ingenuity of soldiers and support personnel. But even this could not offset the fundamental pointlessness of the engagement. Supply lines kept the defenders alive, but the purpose of fighting remained a question: to kill more of the enemy than the enemy could kill of you, without the expectation of achieving any meaningful objective. Every meter gained by the Germans was reclaimed by the French. Every fort taken was retaken. For those in the trenches, survival itself became the metric of success, not territorial control or strategic advantage. Verdun stripped war of all pretense of meaning, reducing it to an endless calculus of human life versus symbolic victory. Medical and psychological consequences further underlined Verdun as a symbol of pointless attrition. Tens of thousands were wounded, many permanently disabled. Shell shock, known at the time as neurasthenia or shell shock, affected soldiers' mental health profoundly. Hospitals overflowed, and treatment was rudimentary. With many men left to recover or not recover on the battlefield itself, corpses, disease, and exposure compounded the suffering. The battle illustrated that attrition was not just a loss of manpower, but a loss of human potential. A squandering of trained, capable individuals in a struggle dictated by ego rather than strategic necessity. Verdun also demonstrated the psychological manipulation of attrition. High command on both sides believed that relentless pressure would break the enemy's morale. Yet, instead of collapsing, soldiers adapted, endured, and continued fighting. In this way, the attritional strategy became almost absurdly counterproductive. The more men were sacrificed, the more hardened the defenders became. Ego-driven planning failed to account for human resilience, turning the battle into an endless cycle of destruction with no strategic resolution. Finally, Verdun's legacy is inseparable from its symbolic meaning. The battle became shorthand for the futility of World War I and the human cost of industrialized, ego-driven conflict. It is remembered not for territorial gain or decisive victory, but for the grinding, dehumanizing toll it exacted on soldiers and civilians alike. Verdun proves that when military strategy prioritizes pride, symbolism, or personal ambition over clear objectives in human life, the result is catastrophic, pointless, and unforgettable. It is the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when warfare is reduced to attrition at any cost. If you liked this brutal dive into the horrors of Verdun, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. Your support helps us dig deep into the dumbest, deadliest decisions in history. From ego-driven generals to catastrophically mismanaged battles, bringing you the real story behind the textbook lines.